Hello there. Hello, everyone. Hello, Sissy Lala and Ellen and Mary. And she reads a lot. You were the first four up today, and I'm sure there are others here now. Welcome, everyone. I'm Gildart Jackson, and this is Fireside Reading, where I'm going to sit in front of the fire and I'm going to read to you the next part of the next chapter of in Siddhartha. We've been reading this book for a week or so now, and we have probably be finished this week, maybe next week. And then it's time for another book. I have an idea for something very quick. It would take a couple of days, but still looking for suggestions for a big book that'll set us up for a little bit of the summer. Anybody has any thoughts, please send them to firesidereadingwithgildart@gmail.com. Let's see what happens in the second part of Chapter 9. Welcome to a Fireside Reading of Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. Chapter 9, Part 2. And once again, when the river had just increased its flow in the rainy season and made a powerful noise, then said Siddhartha, "Isn't it so, O friend? The river has many voices, very many voices. Hasn't it the voice of a king, and of a warrior, and of a bull, and of a bird of the night, and of a woman giving birth, and of a sighing man, and 1,000 other voices more?" "So it is," Vasudeva said. "All voices of the creatures are in its voice." "And do you know," Siddhartha continued, "what word it speaks when you succeed in hearing all of its 10,000 voices at once?" Happily, Vasudeva's face was smiling. He bent over to Siddhartha and spoke the holy Om into his ear. And this had been the very thing that Siddhartha had also been hearing. And time after time, his smile became more similar to the ferryman's, became almost just as bright, almost just as thoroughly glowing with bliss, just as shining out of 1,000 small wrinkles, just as alike to a child's, just as alike to an old man's. Many travellers, seeing the two ferrymen, thought they were brothers. Often they sat in the evening together by the bank on the log, said nothing, and both listened to the water, which was no water to them, but the voice of life, the voice of what exists, of what is eternally taking shape. And it happened from time to time that both, when listening to the river, thought of the same things, of a conversation from the day before yesterday, of one of their travellers, the face and fate of whom had occupied their thoughts, of death, of their childhood, and that they both, in the same moment, when the river had been saying something good to them, looked at each other, both thinking precisely the same thing, both delighted about the same answer to the same question. There was something about this ferry and the two ferrymen which was transmitted to others, which many of the travellers felt. It happened occasionally that a traveller, after having looked at the face of one of the ferrymen, started to tell the story of his life, told about pains, confessed evil things, asked for comfort and advice. It happened occasionally that someone asked for permission to stay for a night with them to listen to the river. It also happened that curious people came, who had been told that there were two wise men, or sorcerers, or holy men, living by that ferry. The curious people asked many questions, but they got no answers, and they found neither sorcerers nor wise men. They only found two friendly little old men, who seemed to be mute and to have become a bit strange and gaga. And the curious people laughed and were discussing how foolishly and gullibly the common people were spreading such empty rumors. The years passed by, and nobody counted them. Then, at one time, monks came by on a pilgrimage, followers of Gautama, the Buddha, who were asking to be ferried across the river. And by them the ferrymen were told that they were most hurriedly walking back to their great teacher, for the news had spread the Exalted One was deadly sick, and would soon die his last human death, in order to become one with the salvation. It was not long until a new flock of monks came along on their pilgrimage, and another one, and the monks, as well as most of the other travellers and people walking through the land, spoke of nothing else than of Gautama and his impending death. And as people are flocking from everywhere and from all sides, when they are going to war or to the coronation of a king, and are gathering like ants in droves, thus they flocked, like being drawn on by a magic spell, to where the great Buddha was awaiting his death, where the huge event was to take place, and the great perfected one of an era was to become one with the glory. Often Siddhartha thought in those days of the dying wise man, the great teacher, whose voice had admonished nations and had awoken hundreds of thousands, whose voice he had also once heard, whose holy face he had also once seen with respect. Kindly he thought of him, saw his path to perfection before his eyes, and remembered with a smile those words which he had once as a young man said to him, the Exalted One. They had been, so it seemed to him, proud and precocious words. With a smile he remembered them. For a long time he knew that there was nothing standing between Gautama and him any more, though he was still unable to accept his teachings. No, there was no teaching a truly searching person, someone who truly wanted to find, could accept. But he who had found, he could approve of any teachings, every path, every goal. There was nothing standing between him and all the other 1,000 any more who lived in that what is eternal, who breathed what is divine. On one of these days, when so many went on a pilgrimage to the dying Buddha, Kamala also went to him, who used to be the most beautiful of the courtesans. A long time ago she had retired from her previous life, had given her garden to the monks of Gautama as a gift, had taken her refuge in the teachings, was among the friends and benefactors of the pilgrims. Together with Siddhartha, her boy, her son, she had gone on her way due to the news of the near death of Gautama, in simple clothes, on foot. With her little son, she was travelling by the river. But the boy had soon grown tired, desired to go back home, desired to rest, desired to eat, became disobedient and started whining. Kamala often had to take a rest with him. He was accustomed to having his way against her. She had to feed him, had to comfort him, had to scold him. He did not comprehend why he had to go on this exhausting and sad pilgrimage with his mother to an unknown place, to a stranger who was holy and about to die. So what if he died? How did this concern the boy? The pilgrims were getting close to Vasudeva's ferry, when little Siddhartha once again forced his mother to rest. She, Kamala herself, had also become tired, and while the boy was chewing a banana, she crouched down on the ground, closed her eyes a bit, and rested. But suddenly she uttered a wailing scream. The boy looked at her in fear and saw her face having grown pale from horror, and from under her dress a small black snake fled, by which Kamala had been bitten. Hurriedly they now both ran along the path in order to reach people and got near to the ferry, where Kamala collapsed and was not able to go on any further. But the boy started crying miserably, only interrupting it to kiss and hug his mother, and she also joined his loud screams for help, until the sound reached Vasudeva's ears, who stood at the ferry. Quickly he came walking, took the woman in his arms, carried her into the boat. The boy ran along, and soon they all reached the hut, where Siddhartha stood by the stove and was just lighting the fire. He looked up and first saw the boy's face, which wondrously reminded him of something, like a warning to remember something he had forgotten. Then he saw Kamala, whom he instantly recognized, though she lay unconscious in the ferryman's arms, and now he knew that it was his own son whose face had been such a warning reminder to him, and the heart stirred in his chest. Kamala's wound was washed, but had already turned black, and her body was swollen. She was made to drink a healing potion. Her consciousness returned. She lay on Siddhartha's bed in the hut, and bent over her stood Siddhartha, who used to love her so much. It seemed like a dream to her. With a smile, she looked at her friend's face. Just slowly she realized her situation, remembered the bite, called timidly to the boy. "He's with you, don't worry," said Siddhartha. Kamala looked into his eyes. She spoke with a heavy tongue, paralyzed by the poison. "You've become old, my dear," she said. "You've become grey. But you are like the young Samana, who at one time came without clothes, with dusty feet to me into the garden. You are much more like him than you were like him at that time when you had left me and Kamaswami. In the eyes you're like him, Siddhartha. Alas, I have also grown old. Could you still recognize me?" Siddhartha smiled. "Instantly I recognized you, Kamala, my dear." Kamala pointed to her boy and said, "Did you recognize him as well? He is your son." Her eyes became confused and fell shut. The boy wept. Siddhartha took him on his knees, let him weep, petted his hair, and at the sight of the child's face, a Brahman prayer came to his mind, which he had learned a long time ago when he had been a little boy himself. Slowly, with a singing voice, he started to speak. From his past and childhood, the words came flowing to him. And with that sing-song, the boy became calm, was only now and then uttering a sob, and fell asleep. Siddhartha placed him on Vasudeva's bed. Vasudeva stood by the stove and cooked rice. Siddhartha gave him a look which he returned with a smile. "She'll die," Siddhartha said quietly. Vasudeva nodded. Over his friendly face ran the light of the stove's fire. Once again Kamala returned to consciousness. Pain distorted her face. Siddhartha's eyes read the suffering on her mouth, on her pale cheeks. Quietly he read it, attentively, waiting, his mind becoming one with her suffering. Kamala felt it. Her gaze sought his eyes. Looking at him, she said, "Now I see that your eyes have changed as well. They've become completely different. By what do I still recognize that you're Siddhartha? It's you and it's not you." Siddhartha said nothing. Quietly his eyes looked at hers. "You have achieved it?" she asked. "You have found peace?" He smiled and placed his hand on hers. "I'm seeing it," she said. "I'm seeing it. I too will find peace." "You have found it," Siddhartha spoke in a whisper. Kamala never stopped looking into his eyes. She thought about her pilgrimage to Gautama, which she wanted to take, in order to see the face of the perfected one, to breathe his peace. And she thought that she had now found him in his place, and that it was good, just as good, as if she had seen the other one. She wanted to tell this to him, but the tongue no longer obeyed her will. Without speaking, she looked at him, and he saw the life fading from her eyes. When the final pain filled her eyes and made them grow dim, when the final shiver ran through her limbs, his finger closed her eyelids. For a long time, he sat and looked at her peacefully dead face. For a long time he observed her mouth, her old tired mouth, with those lips which had become thin, and he remembered that he used to, in the spring of his years, compare this mouth with a freshly cracked fig. For a long time he sat, read in the pale face, in the tired wrinkles, filled himself with this sight, saw his own face lying in the same manner, just as white, just as quenched out, and saw at the same time his face and hers being young, with red lips, with fiery eyes, and the feeling of this both being present and at the same time real, the feeling of eternity, completely filled every aspect of his being. Deeply he felt, more deeply than ever before, in this hour, the indestructibility of every life, the eternity of every moment. When he rose, Vasudeva had prepared rice for him, but Siddhartha did not eat. In the stable where their goats stood, the two old men prepared beds of straw for themselves, and Vasudeva lay himself down to sleep. But Siddhartha went outside and sat this night before the hut, listening to the river, surrounded by the past, touched and encircled by all times of his life at the same time. But occasionally he rose, stepped to the door of the hut and listened, whether the boy was sleeping. Early in the morning, even before the sun could be seen, Vasudeva came out of the stable and walked over to his friend. "You haven't slept," he said. "No, Vasudeva, I sat here. I was listening to the river. A lot it has told me. Deeply it has filled me with the healing thought, with the thought of oneness. You've experienced suffering, Siddhartha, but I see no sadness has entered your heart." "No, my dear, how should I be sad? I, who have been rich and happy, have become even richer and happier now. My son has been given to me." "Your son shall be welcome to me as well. But now, Siddhartha, let's get to work. There is much to be done. Kamala has died on the same bed on which my wife had died a long time ago. Let us also build Kamala's funeral pile on the same hill on which I had then built my wife's funeral pile." While the boy was still asleep, they built the funeral pile. Thank you all for joining me. I'll see you all tomorrow, same time and place, 5 Pacific at Fireside Reading on Instagram. Until then, everyone, do stay very, very well indeed.